As the sun rose on the city of Halifax, Nova Scotia, on the 6th of December, 1917, a chain of events began to unfold that would bring death and destruction to so many of its citizens, changing the city forever. On this episode of Never Stop Learning, we will be taking a look at the sinking of the SS Mont Blanc, otherwise known as the Halifax explosion. Our story starts not in Halifax Harbor, but 850 miles to the south in New York. The French tramp steamer Mont Blanc, captained by Ami Le Medic, had just finished its 3-week stay in the Big Apple, where the ship's hold was refitted with wooden partitions to hold its very deadly cargo. The Mont Blanc had been tasked with carrying 3,000 tons of explosives across the Atlantic to the war in Europe. Across her deck, the ship had also been loaded with hundreds of barrels of highly flammable benzol fuel. The ship was making its way to Halifax to rendezvous with a convoy that would be departing for Europe under the protection of the HMS Highflyer. As the French ship chugged along at a speed of 8 knots, tensions were high as both captain and crew were well aware of the volatile cargo fastened securely below deck. As the SS Mont Blanc made its journey towards Halifax, the SS Imo, captained by Håkon From, was already arriving in the port city. The Norwegian freighter, bound for New York, had made the stop in Halifax to reload on coal and supplies. Captain From was not a patient man, and he had his reasons, as his ship had been chartered to deliver emergency shipments of food to war-ravaged Belgium and northern France. By late afternoon on December 5th, the IMO was still awaiting its 50 tons of steam coal. In early 1915, after multiple German U-boats had been sighted off of Canada's east coast, countermeasures had been taken to protect Bedford Basin, which was the home of Halifax Harbor. Anti-submarine nets were placed at the mouth of the harbor, and every evening at sunset, access to the harbor was closed. By the time the IMO had been loaded with coal, the sun had set, and the nets were in place. Captain Håkon and his ship wouldn't be going anywhere until the next morning. Outside the harbor, the Mont Blanc had arrived at the examining area, just outside the entrance to Halifax. Daylight was quickly disappearing, and the Mont Blanc still needed to wait for their harbor pilot to arrive. Francis Mackey was a harbor pilot of 24 years. Mackey took pride in the fact that in all that time, he had never had an accident, a perfect record. As he climbed aboard the Mont Blanc, he greeted Captain Medic, and the two headed to the captain's cabin to discuss the ship's cargo. Being this late in the day, the Mont Blanc was going to have to wait until morning before the ship would be granted access to Halifax Harbor. As the morning sun rose on the horizon, Captain Medic was preparing himself for the day. Below him, he could already feel the ship's engines coming to life. Medic headed to the bridge to find harbor pilot Francis Mackey already waiting for the captain's orders to proceed. Mackey, now well aware of the ship's volatile cargo, advised the captain and his officers that the Mont Blanc would be moving at about 4 knots on its way into the harbor. There were 9 vessels in queue to enter Halifax that morning, with only one ahead of the Mont Blanc. The order was given to weigh anchor, and all eyes turned to the tramp steamer SS Clara as she moved into the harbor ahead of the Mont Blanc. At the same time, 12 miles to the north, an impatient Captain Håkon From was preparing his departure from Halifax. It was no secret that the captain was in a bad mood after his delayed coal shipment had put him so far behind schedule. Once his harbor pilot William Hayes arrived, From wasted no time weighing anchor. The ship slowly snaked its way through the harbor, and once clear of the more than 30 ships anchored in Bedford Basin, the helmsman steered the ship toward the quarter-mile wide entrance, nicknamed the Narrows. Hayes gave the order for full speed ahead. The IMO would soon leave Halifax behind, and Håkon From intended on doing his best once in the open ocean to make up for lost time. All was going smoothly, or so it seemed, until William Hayes caught sight of an approaching ship, materializing out of the early morning mist. At first glance, the vessel seemed to be in the same lane in which the IMO was traveling. This was the SS Clara, piloted by Edward Renner. Renner had the ship moving through the waters on the Halifax side of the channel. This would have the ships passing on their starboard sides, which in the world of nautical navigation was a major violation of the rules. The rules of navigation for ships as they pass in a harbor or narrow channel dictate that each vessel must bear to the right and pass each other on the port side. If there is any confusion, procedure states that ship's pilots or captains sign their intentions audibly through ship's horns. 1 blast for passing on the starboard side, 2 blasts for the port side, and finally 3 blasts, which signal that the ship is about to reverse her engines. To all Halifax harbor pilots, these rules were second nature. Renner, who had been on the job for 6 years, had a tendency of doing things his own way, which was a constant irritation to naval officials, and on this morning, the consequences of his actions would be dire. William Hayes aboard the IMO, being in a bit of a hurry, was willing to overlook Renner's carelessness, and both ships passed on their starboard sides. As they did so, Renner used his megaphone to let Hayes know that there was another ship coming in right behind him. Hayes acknowledged this and looked south to see another ship appearing out of the early morning mist, less than a mile ahead. This ship, the Stella Maris, was previously a British gunboat that had been repurposed into a tugboat and salvage vessel. That morning, it was towing 2 barges loaded with ashes from the naval yard. On the bridge of the IMO, Hayes was annoyed to see another ship not in its proper lane. The Stella Maris was moving through the Narrows mid-channel, and this had Hayes keeping to starboard to avoid colliding with the barge. Up ahead through the morning haze, another ship materialized. This one, Hayes could tell, was riding low in the water as it slowly chugged north through the channel. The time was now 8:30, and aboard the Mont Blanc, Francis Mackey was monitoring ship traffic ahead. He was concerned to see a ship on the Dartmouth side of the channel closing on the Mont Blanc at an alarming speed. If she continued this course, she would cut across the Mont Blanc's path, which might cause the ships to collide. Mackey knew that Hayes was piloting the IMO, and he couldn't understand what would be possessing his friend to be moving so quickly into oncoming traffic. Mackey gave a quick pull of the whistle cord and ordered the ship to dead slow. Then, he had the helmsman turn the ship slightly starboard to move even closer to the Dartmouth shore. Hayes was puzzled by the single toot from the approaching ship. He had no choice but to believe that the ship intended to go right, so he moved even closer to the Dartmouth side of the channel. As the ships moved ever closer to one another, there was no doubt that they were on a collision course. Out of options, Captain Medic made a last-ditch effort to avoid disaster. He shouted to the helmsman to turn the ship hard to port. William Hayes aboard the IMO attempted to reverse the ship's engines. This was a last-second Hail Mary attempt to avoid collision, and it may have worked, but when a ship's engines are reversed, it creates what's called transverse thrust. This turned the bow of the IMO to starboard, aiming it directly at the Mont Blanc. In the moments before the collision, time seemed to slow for all on the IMO and the Mont Blanc. It seemed like a bad dream, but it was all too real. The 430-foot IMO pierced the Mont Blanc on the starboard side, sinking deep into her hull. The impact tossed several barrels of incredibly volatile benzol fuel, which broke open when they hit the deck, spreading the highly flammable substance across the front of the ship and into the cargo hold below. With the IMO's engines still in full reverse, the ship slowly began to pull its bow from the hole in the Mont Blanc. Across the harbor, the sound of scraping metal echoed as the IMO's anchor dragged across the double-riveted steel plates deep within the French ship. This caused a rain of sparks, which instantly ignited the spilt fuel. The ships finally separated as the IMO lurched north towards the Dartmouth shore, and the Mont Blanc went in the opposite direction towards Halifax. The tiny flames quickly grew and became an inferno, consuming the front of the ship. Large plumes of black smoke began to pour from the new hole in the Mont Blanc's hull. The fuse had been lit on what would be the largest man-made explosion the world had ever seen. If you've enjoyed this episode so far, give us a like and subscribe to see everything else this channel has to offer. With the bow of the Mont Blanc engulfed in flames, it was clear to the crew that the ship was doomed. Explosions periodically sent massive fireballs soaring into the air. It was only a matter of time before the flames reached the explosives stored deep within the ship. The crew gathered on deck, awaiting the captain's order to abandon ship. The moment the lifeboats hit the water, the men began to pour into them, hoping to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the ticking time bomb that was the Mont Blanc. As the lifeboats rowed away, the ship drifted towards Pier 6. Crowds were gathering on shore to watch the spectacle. It was reported that as the lifeboats moved away, the crew of the Mont Blanc could be seen waving all vessels in the area to get away, but no one seemed to understand the French. The hands of the Citadel Hill clock stopped at 9:04 a.m. This was the exact moment of the Halifax Harbor explosion of 1917. The blast that disintegrated the Mont Blanc took more than 2,000 lives and devastated the city of Halifax. It was the largest man-made explosion in history and held that title until the atomic bomb was dropped on Japan in 1945. The shockwave of an explosion this size is truly terrifying. Invisible, yet it can send human bodies and objects as big as a house flying like leaves in the wind. It can rupture eyeballs and shatter eardrums. A piece of the Mont Blanc's 1,100-pound anchor launched itself skyward before crashing down through a roof 2.5 miles away. Within the blast zone, air temperatures flashed to 9,000 degrees Fahrenheit, almost as hot as the sun. The force of the explosion also created a 30-foot wall of water that moved across the harbor, tossing ships of all sizes up onto the shore. The wave moved through the city, dragging people to their deaths. At Ground Zero, there was nothing left. Pier 6 and 8, along with all the buildings on each of them, were obliterated. Everyone in Halifax that day had a story of heartbreak, suffering, and loss to tell. With so many people in the blast zone of the explosion, it is impossible to truly tell everyone's story, but here are several individuals and their stories of tragedy. In a wooden shack located roughly 100 yards from Pier 6, Vince Coleman, the railway telegraph operator, was exchanging information with the night dispatcher when their conversation was interrupted by the sounds of explosions not far away. Moments later, the sky to the southeast became full of black smoke billowing upward. Coleman knew this couldn't be good. Just then, a red-faced sailor came rushing into the office. "Boys, you've got to get out of here. Run for it right now. A French munition ship is on fire. She's gonna blow sky high any second." Coleman went to grab his coat, but stopped himself. He remembered that the overnight passenger train number 10 was inbound and would be arriving any minute. With upwards of 300 souls aboard, Coleman knew that the train would pass right next to where the French ship was ablaze. With his heart pounding, he sat down at his desk and began tapping away at his telegraph key. "Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbor, making for Pier 5. Will explode. I guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys." Coleman died instantly in the explosion. This moment was made famous in the Heritage Minute short from the early 1990s. At Pier 6, the crew of the fire truck Patricia were battling the blaze of the Mont Blanc. Firefighter Billy Wells was moving the pumper truck into position next to a fire hydrant when the explosion occurred. The fireball that erupted incinerated everything and everyone with one exception. Billy, who had been seated in the driver's seat of the fire truck Patricia, now found himself standing 50 yards from where Pier 6 had been and was completely naked. The blast had torn the clothes from his body, along with most of the flesh on his right arm. In his left hand, Billy was still clutching a piece of the fire truck steering wheel. He looked around for the rest of the truck along with his crew, but there was nothing. They were all gone. He had no time to think, as the next instant, a wall of water 30 feet high swept over him and carried him away. Somehow he survived his ordeal, and when he regained consciousness, he began to move westward, looking for help. Before the explosion, harbor pilot William Hayes and Captain Haakon Fromm of the IMO couldn't believe their eyes. They watched as the flames consumed the Mont Blanc. Hayes' perfect record was gone. How could he explain himself? Captain Fromm was also distraught. This would delay the IMO from getting to New York, and there was no way that the captain would be back in Norway for Christmas. As the ship was turning around to head back toward Bedford Basin, the Mont Blanc exploded. The shrieking barrage of white-hot metal bits that peppered the IMO's hull perforated the ship's bridge and sheared off her funnel as the force from the blast lifted the ship out of the water and hurled her towards the Dartmouth shore. Helmsman Johan Johansson would recall he just saw a flash of white and then a moment later was tossed into the air, but he would survive. Captain Haakon and William Hayes were not as lucky. The white-hot metal bits from the Mont Blanc tore through the IMO's bridge, killing the two men instantly. Captain Fromm was decapitated and his body was found riddled with jagged metal bits. Annie O'Neill and her husband Bernie lived with her mother and sister in a house not far from Pier 6. With the Mont Blanc ablaze in the harbor, they had a spectacular view from their fourth-story window. Few stood a chance when the ship exploded. When Bernie came to, he found himself lying in a pile of splintered lumber, the kitchen stove resting on his chest. Husband and wife were the only survivors in the house. 16 other occupants had died instantly. Annie was horrified to see her husband pinned beneath the stove. To make matters worse, what was left of the house was now engulfed in flames. Annie staggered out to the street looking for help, but only found a hulk of a man who was also in a bad way himself. Determined to save her husband, she ran back and began to pull him from beneath the stove. She yanked and pulled until she was able to free him. Ignoring her own injuries, she half-dragged, half-carried her husband from the burning building. He was in rough shape as he had lost a large chunk of flesh and most of the skin on his chest. The window had shattered inward during the explosion, and Bernie's body was peppered with shards of glass. They must have had a guardian angel, as after their ordeal, they encountered a policeman who tasked some soldiers with transporting the couple to a nearby hospital. Francis Mackey and the crew of the Mont Blanc had made their way to the shores of Turtle Grove before the explosion occurred. Home to a small indigenous settlement, the crewmen jumped ashore and began to sprint as fast as their legs would take them. Captain Medique ordered a roll call, and despite their fears, the men obeyed and lined up to be counted, all except one who had run ahead to hide in the woods. Once roll call was complete, the men ran for the woods. One woman named Aggie March was standing on her front porch with her baby when the Frenchmen ran by. Not understanding their warnings to run, one crewman snatched the woman's baby before running deep into the woods, with the woman chasing close behind. This action ended up saving the woman and her baby from the explosion. The force of the blast rendered Mackey unconscious, but luckily they were far enough away that the tsunami didn't overtake them. Amazingly, only one member of the Mont Blanc's crew perished when a large piece of metal embedded itself in his back. The Great Halifax Harbor explosion of 1917 destroyed more than 1,500 buildings and damaged 12,000 more. 6,000 Haligonians suddenly found themselves homeless. Another 25,000 found themselves without adequate shelter. Roughly 2,000 lost their lives, with hundreds dying instantly. The people of Nova Scotia are nothing if not resilient. Life in Halifax would be changed forever, but it would go on. Thanks for watching this episode of Never Stop Learning. Please give us a like and subscribe if you haven't done so already, as it really helps us out. Until next time. Hey everyone, thanks for sticking with me to the end. Consider checking out our Patreon page to donate and help fund new videos. And if you have a shipwreck that you would like me to cover, let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.